advice. You never know if it could change your life. Take a chance, you're neither wrong or right. You never know if you don't go.
Hello, everyone. Good tidings and fair lancing to you all. Welcome back to another episode of Dungeon Master of None.
I'm Dungeon Master Matt.
I'm Dungeon Master Rob, and we have a very special guest with us today. Hello and welcome, Meaghan.
Hello, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Now, Meaghan, I brought Rob. I brought all these gold coins with me. I sure hope they're going to be worth a lot here.
They are
in
absolutely
Krynn.
worthless. Just throw them in the garbage.
Damn it!
Cold, hard steel. That's all we want here.
That's right. We have Meaghan on, a longtime listener, but also a expert in her own right on the Dragonlance setting, which we have been talking about for a long time now, but the time is nigh because there have been announcements. There's a new book out. There's a new setting book, board game, all sorts of things. This is the time, and we're going to go into detail about all of that stuff. But Matt and I are relative naifs when it comes to this particular setting, so we are very excited to have you, Meaghan, an expert on to school us on all things Dragonlance and Krynn.
Dragonlance is coming. There's nowhere to hide from it anymore.
There really is not. There's nowhere to hide. It's everywhere.
Yeah, my experience with Dragonlance is definitely like reading the original or core trilogy of novels in high school. I think that is really it.
Me too, and I was telling Meaghan about this before we started recording, but I got most of my science fiction fantasy from the library when I was, a young teen, which is when I started reading a lot of it, and they had Dragons of Autumn Twilight, Dragons of Winter Night, Dragons of Spring Dawning, and none of the others. So I think I read those maybe twice, but I did not encounter the many other books until much later in life when I had sort of moved on. Meaghan, do you know how many novels, how many sort of books there are in the Dragonlance canon? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I'm just curious. This is not a quiz.
I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. I want to say somewhere between like 130 and 150.
Wow.
That is many.
And depending on how you define a novel, there's full-length novels, there's abridged novels for younger readers, and there's anthology collections that aren't necessarily novels, there's novellas, there's stories that were published in Dragon originally. So there's a lot of Dragonlance content out there.
I mean, my main memory from reading Dragons of Autumn Twilight and its sequels is that it is a lot of proud representation for bearded guys. Tanis Half-Elven inspired me to grow the amazing beard that I have today, and that's my main takeaway.
Well, you don't look like an elf at all, so it's done its job.
I know. I'm torn between two worlds and hiding my heritage by growing this beard. Dragonlance is like such an interesting campaign setting in that it's definitely like, kind of in that second generation of TSR campaign settings. Came out in the mid 80s. Was like really tried to be the Tolkien story focused campaign setting of epic fantasy, capital E, capital F. Just to open, Meaghan, do you want to tell us about your experience with Dragonlance and why you love it and why other people should love it?
Yeah, I started reading Dragonlance when I was in middle school. I won't date myself by saying what year that was, but I started reading, I had a friend who was reading the Chronicles trilogy, and he gave me his copy of Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and he said, you should read this, you might like it. And I devoured the first 3 of the series. I was not really a fantasy person up until then. I had read a few young adult fantasy novels, but I hadn't read The Hobbit at that point. I certainly hadn't read Lord of the Rings. Dragonlance was really sort of my first introduction to fantasy in general. So I devoured the first trilogy. I devoured the second trilogy, which is the Legends trilogy. The second one written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, which is sort of the sequel trilogy to the first one. And then I was fortunate that my library had a large collection of Dragonlance books. So there was a lot of them for me to read. The Tales anthologies, the the series that's called The Preludes, which is sort of about what the heroes of the Lance were doing before they all met up in Dragons of Autumn Twilight. So there was quite a collection at my library. So I was steeped in it pretty quickly, pretty early on. And I've just been reading Dragonlance novels my whole life. I never stopped. I just kept reading them right into my adulthood. I played, I didn't play, but I had the second edition box set that was called Tales of the Lance. So there was like the setting guide, and there was a game that was included in it, and that was for second edition. I didn't play third edition at all, period. But when fifth edition came out, I was like, oh, I can't wait to play fifth edition Dragonlance. And wait, where is it? 10 years, you say? 10 years, you say? Fifth edition has been out, and there's no Dragonlance book, the bread and butter of TSR in the early 80s, not being represented in fifth edition. I can't believe that. What do they have? Forgotten Realms? Wow.
Yeah, eventually somehow Eberron, but yeah, finally, 10 years-ish on, we're getting Dragonlance.
Thank goodness we've got Theros. That's right. That's what matters.
Yeah. People were really agitating for Theros. The hordes were clamoring for a Theros adventure setting book.
Well, let's talk about campaign setting, like Dragonlance as a campaign setting. Like, what does it have to really recommend it over the Forgotten Realms or over any of the other myriad, I guess, 6 other campaign settings you can use for 5th edition? Like, why should we be hyped about a Dragonlance campaign setting?
I think that the appeal of Dragonlance is, and always has been, the notion that you could do epic stories using the Dragonlance setting. It's not a setting that's designed to have dungeon crawls for the most part. It's not as if there's, the ruins of ancient civilizations that you go out and explore. It's really designed to be more about sort of alliances between factions, alliances between kingdoms, grand adventures. It's not like the red wizards are over here and they're doing some scheme, and meanwhile over here this is happening. No, it's like a world war kind of fantasy setting, and I think that's what they were originally going for with the first releases. The original War of the Lance campaign series was intended to be sort of a world war setting where everything was in chaos, and it was this battle between the forces of good and the forces of darkness. And the presence of dragons is supposed to be one of the major draws for Dragonlance. In a lot of settings, dragons are, sitting on their treasure hoards, or they're doing their schemes somewhere else in private, and the adventurers come along and kill them. In Dragonlance, they're very, very much supposed to be a part of the world. They're involved in the warfare. It's very easy to be a dragon rider in a Dragonlance campaign setting. Of course, there's the Dragonlance itself, the actual item, which is meant to kind of level the playing field so that fighting a dragon isn't quite as, you can go toe-to-toe with a dragon if you've got your Dragonlance and you're on dragon back. I think that's part of the draw to it as well. And I think that the last thing is that Dragonlance has kind of at least when it starts, has this kind of almost post-apocalyptic or like Dark Ages kind of feel to it, because the setting is still reeling from the Cataclysm, which is sort of the wrath of the gods, the meteor hurled at the doomed city of Istar, which rearranges the entire continent, and the true gods vanish. It spreads chaos and misery and famine and war throughout the entire continent. So the world is very fractured when the story picks up. So you're kind of it's a blank slate, but also one on which you could tell really grand stories, more so than dungeon crawl stories. I think that's my way of explaining that what makes Dragonlance a little bit different. That's
a good answer. So you sort of answered this. Actually, you answered this pretty well. But my understanding and my memory of like what makes the Dragonlance stories good and interesting, and what makes the setting unique is scale, right? It's it's big stories. Like you said, it's a world war. The dragons are actively involved. You have your protagonists, like the characters in the stories are, big heroes, like like Rhystalin, who I saying that right? Wants to eventually become
Raistlin.
Raistlin.
There's not an official canonical pronunciation, but everybody says Raistlin, like raisin, but with a T.
I'll take it. I don't know that I've ever said that name out loud, though I was involved in many, many internet arguments about who would win, Raistlin versus Goku, Raistlin versus Superman, that kind of thing in the early in the early aughts. Anyway, sorry. There's big, like very powerful heroes. You're not looking at a Fellowship of the Ring that's fleeing from Sauron. You're looking at mighty war heroes and powerful wizards, and the scale is larger. And there's also some distinctions with deities and gods and differences, especially from Forgotten Realms, the way that magic works. Some of this is subtle, some of it is not, but it gives Dragonlance a very distinct flavor while still being familiar. I think this is, to me, one of the strengths of both the setting as just for the books, but also for the campaigns, is that it's, if you want something that's recognizably D&D, but a little bit of an interesting twist on it, I think that Dragonlance does a great job of that.
Well, the setting is sort of dependent upon its pantheon. Dragonlance has a balanced pantheon. There's 7 gods of good, 7 gods of evil, and 7 gods of neutrality. And the idea is that these 3 forces are always in either swinging back and forth like a pendulum, or they're trying to maintain this uneasy balance. And then whenever one of them gets too powerful, something has to come along and right it. So during the reign of Istar, the forces of good become too powerful, and something has to be done about it, and that's the Cataclysm. During the War of the Lance, the forces of evil become too strong, and so the gods of good have to directly intervene to try to balance things out. And so that's one of the important themes of Dragonlance, is this balance between good and evil that has to be maintained at all times. And that really informs the rest of the world. There's the 2 primary deities. Paladine is basically Bahamut. He's the platinum dragon. And then there's Takhisis, the Queen of Darkness, who is essentially Tiamat, the 5-headed dragon. And the idea is that they are the 2 sort of progenitor, creator gods of this world, Krynn, which I take to mean, based on what came out in Fizban's Treasury of Dragons, I believe now that Dragonlance was the first world. As they describe it.
That's I like that, and I forgot that there was well, we talked about this in another pod, but they've been intimating, suggesting, making noises over at Wizards that this is all one unified cosmos somehow. And Krynn is the first world. That makes sense, right? The progenitor dragons. That's right.
Well, if Bahamut and Takhisis, or Bahamut and Tiamat created the first world together, and that would Bahamut make them... and Tiamat are Paladine and Takhisis, then... Yeah, and magic is a lot different as well. Do you want me to go into the difference with magic? And
yeah, I mean, I loved in the novels and reading back over things, you've got like these orders of wizardry, the test of high sorcery, the black, white, and red robes. You have a very established like wizard hierarchy, and there's no fucking around with clerics here. Like you can't be a cleric of an alignment. Like you need a god, and you need a god badly. And depending on when you set the campaign, there might not even be clerics, right?
Yeah, tell us about the magic, because this may or may not.
Get in the magic system. It's a great magic system.
It's a great magic system. And one thing that I'm really interested to see when we get like the real setting book and more details is like how bold Wizards chooses to be with rules on this, because traditionally they're kind of cowardly when it comes to allowing for like any like real distinctions. So if they do go through with, again, the way that magic is in Dragonlance, or traditionally has been, that would be very interesting. So I'm waiting with bated breath, but kind of tell us how it works so that we know what to expect.
Well, this is a hot topic right now among the Dragonlance fandom. And it has been really ever since people started trying to play Dragonlance in 5th edition. So when Dragonlance was created back in the 80s, there was no sorcerer class and there was no warlock class. In fact, the official name for the wizard organization in Dragonlance is called is the Wizards of High Sorcery, or the Towers of High Sorcery, which is itself confusing because it has sorcery right in it, and yet they're wizards, not sorcerers. And the idea was anybody who's a magic user, at least on the continent of Ansalon, which is where when people say Dragonlance or Krynn, really they're talking about the continent of Ansalon. If you were a magic user, you had to belong to the Orders of High Sorcery. If you wanted to go, in terms of game mechanics, if you wanted to get above level 3, you had to officially join the Order and take the test. And the test of High Sorcery is designed to root out those who are either not serious or not capable of practicing magic at higher levels, or would be a danger to the world or themselves or the Order of High Sorcery. So they have the test, and if you succeed, you elevate yourself to higher power. If you fail, you die. If you are a magic user who operates outside this hierarchy, you're considered a renegade, and they will hunt you down, kill you, or force you to come into the fold or whatever. It's a big deal to be a magic user who's not part of the Orders of High Sorcery. And then if you are a member of the Orders of High Sorcery, you either are a white robe if you're good, you're a red robe if you're neutral, you're a black robe if you're evil, and each of them draws their powers from the 3 different moons of Krynn, which are white, red, and black. There's no allowance for sorcerers. There's no allowance for warlocks, which makes it very confusing if you try to play in 5th edition. So it's, well, does the Order of High Sorcery allow warlocks and sorcerers to join them? To join, sort of come into the fold if they're not strictly speaking wizards? Some people say yes, some people say no. Are they just renegades by default because they don't draw their powers from the 3 moons of Krynn? Some people say yes, some people say no. And there is no real resolution to this problem. It's really, how do you want to do it at your table? Do you want to do it the classic way? Do you want to just be more inclusive to 5th edition players who want to play warlocks or want to play sorcerers? It remains to be seen how they will do it in the 5th edition book. We have to wait till it comes out. I am inclined to think that they are going to try to bring sorcerers and warlocks into the fold, because in the Unearthed Arcana, they suggest that it is no longer the Wizards of High Sorcery. It is now the Mages of High Sorcery, suggesting that warlocks and sorcerers can become full-fledged members of the Order of High Sorcery. But we'll have to wait and see until the actual book comes out.
I love, just for the like opportunities of play, I think Dragonlance is all about the kind of like, all right, this is an epic story we're telling, a world war, some kind of continent-wide conflict, and that, like, you know, characters should have really strong motivations, right? If you look at the heroes of the Lance from the novels, right? It's, you know, becoming accepted in a community, navigating a love triangle, like joining a knightly order, you know, stealing stuff. Or,
the
you know,
literal will to power and nothing else. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, to include a big chunk of the character classes in this kind of like organization, the, you know, Mages of High Sorcery, having your characters undergo the test, which is just kind of a fun opportunity for role playing, like, you know, because as I understand it in the lore, like, the test is secret, but it's also like unique to each individual. So it's kind of just like a cool opportunity to expand on your character. Yeah, really personalize like what magic and what power means to you.
Yeah, the test is secret. You don't know what's going to happen going in, and you're not supposed to tell anybody when you come out. But the sort of the most important rule is that if you fail, you die, and even if you survive, you're going to be either physically or mentally changed in some way, which is exactly what happens to Raistlin. If anybody listening has ever seen artwork of Raistlin with white hair and gold skin and hourglass-shaped pupils and wonder what that's all about, he was a normal-looking person when he went into the test, and he came out of the test looking like that. He's kind of an extreme example. It usually doesn't change you that much.
Edgelord of all
wizards.
wizards.
Because he's prime
Ultimate
edgelord. So
he is. He's the first edgelord. He's the edgelord from which all other edgelords have descended.
Absolutely the truth. It's a bad example for generations of young nerds.
So I think one of the other strengths of so we touched on like there's a really cool like magic organization. There are really cool gods and this like balanced pantheon. The world is always kind of like, if you read Lord of the Rings and you got to the end and you're like, oh, this Tolkien guy really hates war. He's not going to dwell on it too much, but you read the appendixes and you're like, oh man, it's really cool how everyone had an alliance against the Dark Lord and people all over the world were coming together to fight. That's like Dragonlance like starts with that. So I think there's a lot of like strengths to the campaign setting. I feel like for me, one of the things why I love all those things, have always felt hesitant to maybe incorporate parts of the campaign setting or run a game in it, is just the amount of material and the amount of like novels that are all like, you know, like Forgotten Realms novels or like Eberron novels. They kind of exist on their like own little side thing. Like we know they're never gonna, you don't have to read them to play, but like Dragonlance novels, they're the story of like the world changing like with each series. And I was just wondering if you had any advice on like maybe how to get over that kind of block. If you're like, I love all these things, I want like Dragon War, but like I'm kind of hesitant about reading somewhere between 130 and 150 novels.
Well, and sorry to jump in here. This might be a good time for you, Meaghan, to help us out with sort of like a history of a truncated history of both the books and the IP in general, you know, how they came out and in what order, and the sort of like evolution of the world. And then maybe that'll lead into answering Matt's question about, you know, where to begin and also where to stop.
Okay, yeah. So what I was thinking that I would do is I would give you a brief synopsis, maybe like 10 minutes each of the novels.
Hell yeah.
Love it.
So that by the time you're done listening to me talk about it for 8.5 hours, you'll be able to run a Dragonlance campaign.
That sounds perfect. Let's
Excellent. Insert
completely
like
within canon.
Yeah.
harp music here.
That's right.
Curtains are drawing back.
That's right.
It's story time, kids.
That's right.
So the brief version of as I was saying to Rob before we started, the history of the world in game and the history of the world behind the scenes are kind of really meshed with each other. So I'll try to tell them sort of simultaneously. The setting was originally conceived in the early 80s by Tracy Hickman and his wife Laura Hickman, when Tracy had just gotten hired by TSR. And he came in, and his sort
if
of
you're unfamiliar, Tracy Hickman, by the way, like wrote the like kind of a Pharaoh series of modules that were well received, and then of course Ravenloft.
Yes, so Laura and Tracy Hickman wrote Ravenloft together, and they also created the Dragonlance setting together. And then when Tracy Hickman arrived at TSR, he had this grand ambition to create this series of modules. There ended up being 16 of them that would tell this overarching narrative, which was something fairly new within the world of Dungeons and Dragons, to have a novel length or a trilogy of novel length story that you're playing out during these modules. And they wanted to do sort of mass media tie-ins with Dragonlance. They didn't want it to be just the game modules. And so that's where the novels came in. They're like, well, why don't we turn these stories into novels? And they brought in Margaret Weiss. She was originally an editor at TSR. She came in to write the novel with Tracy Hickman. Once originally there had been some other author that didn't work out, so they brought in Margaret Weiss to actually be the writer. And they wrote Dragons of Autumn Twilight in 3 months. Can you believe that?
Wow.
Based on this, I mean, it's now sort of legendary within Dungeons and Dragons nerds that the original book, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, was based on their game session of the playthrough. And that's true of the first novel, Dragons of Autumn Twilight. It is not true of the next ones. They realized after the first one that format didn't work. And if you were to go back and sort of reread the first one versus the second and third, you can see the first one is very much a game of Dungeons and Dragons, where they're literally doing dungeon crawls. But then the second and third novels, it kind of opens up a bit more. And then following that, the success of the original trilogy of novels, because the original trilogy of novels was a runaway hit when it came out. Nobody expected it to blow up, but it did. So they wrote the second trilogy of novels, which is the Legends trilogy, which is kind of following Raistlin, his twin brother Caramon, and Raistlin's attempts to become a god. Following that, they continued to produce Dragonlance novels, but Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman left the company for various reasons. It seems like they were not well treated by the company back in the late 80s. So they were gone for a while, and the company continued to produce game materials. I guess the second edition materials would have come out around this time that tried to sort of take what had been done before and package it in a way that was easier to comprehend by doing this Tales of the Lance box set. Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman eventually, when the Dragonlance line started to flag a little bit, they brought Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman back in to write what was conceived of as a second trilogy of novels, and it turned out, or a third trilogy of novels, and ended up being one, which is called Dragons of Spring Dawn, or Dragons of Summer Flame, which is sort of the Ragnarok of Dragonlance. It was supposed to sort of wipe everything clean. When this novel is over, magic is gone, the gods are gone. It's just the world is starting over fresh with no magic, no gods. But TSR wanted to keep making money off Dragonlance novels, so they had to do something else. And so they created this new era called the Fifth Age, which was essentially how they found magic again and how they found divine power again. And everybody hated it.
DC comic problem. You can never restart your world fresh because people still want their Spider-Man stories.
Right. They're attached to the things that their stories, their heroes, their whatever. And so every attempt to start fresh or end things it goes poorly.
And people hated the Fifth Age. I mean, it's bitterly disputed among Dragonlance fans to this day. It has its defenders. It has people who are kind of like, well, if you tweak it a bit, it can kind of be fun. But it was almost universally hated, especially the novels. The novels were very much hated. So what did they do? They brought Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman back in again to fix everything, to sort of reboot this setting in what came to be called the Age of Mortals. I got the names mixed up. The Age of Mortals, Fifth Age, they're kind of interchangeable names, but to sort of reorganize everything, set everything right again. But now Wizards is rebooting the setting by starting over with the War of the Lance and removing sort of the later history. And we're going to have to wait and see. I can tell you Dragonlance fans are not going to be happy. Whatever they do, Dragonlance fans aren't going to be happy.
Well,
there is no way to please everybody.
I'm not surprised to hear that. So this is the question that I have. And so, just looking at the publication history, there were a few that came out, or there was some, they continued publishing something throughout the aughts. And then the last, unique or independent books came out in around 09, 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a, 12-year, at least 13-year gap. And then just this month, just last week, the OGs, Weiss and Hickman, published a new novel, Dragons of Deceit. I guess without spoilers, you have read it, being very impressively on top of this. I didn't even know it was out. Can you tell us a bit what that's about? Is this a reboot? Does it accomplish its aims? Did it satisfy you as a Dragonlance fan?
Yes, I would love to answer, but can I jump backward? Because I never really answered Matt's question.
That's right. Sorry, Matt had a good question about
how to play in Dragonlance if you haven't read all 130 novels.
Yes, sorry. And then I'll ask you about the new book.
It seems like it was like a happy mistake that just the novels became bigger than the game stuff. Oh, hey, the novels are just here to support our campaign, saying, oh, actually, the novels are
people
rad,
love the novels.
And we forgot about the game setting.
Well, the novels, I think, took off because, for a number of reasons. First, they're cheaper. You could go to your bookstore and you can buy a $5 novel versus having to buy a $20 or $25 book. It's something that's accessible even if you're, you could have 5 players at your table. Only the dungeon master needs to buy the setting guide, but if all the players want to read the novel, everybody goes out and reads it. And it's just less of a time commitment if you're a nerd like me who doesn't have any friends when you're in middle school and you can't get together enough people to actually play a game of Dragonlance, you could just read the novel and enjoy it. So it was definitely, the books books outshone the setting and have continued to do so to this day, which is why they continued producing novels long after they stopped making Dragonlance game content. But to play in the world, I think if you're going to be a dungeon master running Dragonlance, I think at least the Chronicles trilogy is kind of required reading. I don't really think that you can get around it. There's several game settings. There's the first edition setting that's called Dragonlance Adventures. There's a second edition setting called Tales of the Lance, and there's a 3.5 edition setting that's just called the Dragonlance Campaign Guide or Dragonlance Campaign setting. However, as you may or may not know, I am here partially as a representative of the Dragonlance Nexus, which is a Dragonlance fan site who produces the Dragonlance Canticle podcast, of which I am the host. And we have created a setting guide for Dragonlance for 5th edition that's called Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything. It is available free on our website, which is dragonlancenexus.com. That is the best way to get everything that you know about Dragonlance. And I'm not just saying it just because it's our product. It's a free product because you can't license Dragonlance materials at this time. So it was made completely free, a labor of love.
Well,
it's still free to this day, but this has everything you need to run Dragonlance.
I can endorse this as well, having muddled through a couple of the older campaign books.
The older campaign books really suck. The 3rd edition one,
really bad.
Not my favorite.
Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything is readable, accessible, and also relevant to 5th edition. So if you are running in 5th edition, unless you really want to dig through some 2nd edition nonsense, Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything, strong recommendation from me for sure.
Yeah, that's honestly, and even if I wasn't involved in the Dragonlance Nexus and you had asked me that question, that's what I would tell you. That's the most condensed and easy to read way to get everything that you need to play in a Dragonlance campaign, and you can do it across multiple settings. So you can do the original War of the Lance setting, you can do the Chaos War setting, you can do the Age of Mortals setting. It's got all the different knightly orders that appear, all the different variations of the divine magic, the different variations of arcane magic. It's got everything. So that's my answer to that question. In answer to Rob's question about the novels, the Dragonlance novels started to kind of drop off in the early aughts. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman came back. They did the War of Souls trilogy in the early 2000s. That was intended to kind of set everything right. And then in the 2009, they finished a trilogy that was called The Lost Chronicles. That was kind of meant to fill in the story gaps in between the Chronicles trilogies. And the last one was Dragons of the Hourglass Mage, which is all about what Raistlin is doing because he's not really in the 3rd Chronicles book. So it's all about what Raistlin is doing during this 3rd Chronicles book. And then we had nothing up until last, Tuesday, was it?
I think so. I think it came out on I just looked at the 2nd. So
August 2nd.
Yeah. Tuesday.
So the most recent, the only, there was a couple Dragonlance novels here and there, but in terms of the core Dragonlance Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman novels, this is the first one that we've had since 2009. It's called Dragons of Deceit. It is set it's set immediately post Legends trilogy, so 3 years after the end of the War of the Lance. And it is a new story about a woman named Destina Rosethorn, who is the daughter of a knight of Solamnia.
Sorry, did you say Destina Rosethorn?
Yes.
Wonderful. I love that.
And she
almost
is
as good as Strom Brightblade. There are so many great names. I love Strom Brightblade.
Sturm.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
So, as you may have guessed, there is themes of destiny in this novel, with Destina trying to fulfill her destiny. And there's, so I don't want to give too much spoilers, but basically her father dies during the War of the Lance, and her life kind of falls apart following the death of her father, and so she hears about this kender named Tasselhoff Burfoot, who had a time-traveling device, which is which is a plot device from the second Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman trilogy. So she goes seeking him out to try to set things right in her life. And things don't go as planned.
I know we have some more questions specifically related to running this and what we can expect or what we might expect from the campaign setting. So I'm gonna ask you one more question about just the setting before we dig a little deeper, because I think it's relevant. But tell it, since this is sort of the narratively a hinge point, can you summarize the War of the Lance and why it's important and relevant to both the books and to the campaign setting?
Yeah, so the War of the Lance, kind of the seminal event of Dragonlance. It's the original modules, the original trilogy of novels, and the upcoming Dragonlance 5e release is all going to center around the War of the Lance. And it is basically, the cataclysm happens in Dragonlance, the gods leave, there is no divine magic, there's no really organized civilization anywhere on Ansalon, for the most part, for about 300 years. And when the story picks up, the Queen of Darkness has been gathered, and I forgot to mention, dragons have not been seen on Krynn for about 1,000 years before the War of the Lance starts. So there's no gods, there's no dragons. And then when the War of the Lance begins, the Queen of Darkness has decided it's time to sort of make her re-entry. So she gathers up the evil dragons who have all been exiled or hibernating this whole time, and she sees that it's a good time to strike because the people are scattered, they're divided, they don't have any leadership, they don't have divine magic. She does. Her forces do. And she creates the Draconians, which are the sort of like Dragonborn that serve as her foot soldiers, and sets out to conquer the entire world. And there's nobody to stand up to her. So she kind of steamrolls across the world, conquering most of it. And then the story from there is these heroes who become involved in sort of, they're not like the frontline fighters for the most part. They're not like the generals leading the battle. They're the kind of Frodos trying to sneak in like under the radar, trying to help out where they can. And so it's following this group of heroes who is trying to sort of do their part for this war effort against this greater backdrop of the War of the Lance, which, like I said before, is this world war with dragons.
Okay.
That's the War of the Lance.
Which is, and this is cool to me, because it sounds like, so let's talk about like what's coming, because the big reason for this conversation is, again, they've announced a whole bunch of things, but perhaps most importantly, a brand new campaign setting for 5th edition. And one cool thing, sorry, this is cool to me, I think it's interesting. They're really leaning into this, that the setting is a war story, that this is taking place in sort of like a fantasy world war, and it's being and the new book is coming either like at the same time or around the same time as what they're calling a battle game. So basically a tabletop game, a board game, or something like that. And our podcast is focused on TTRPGs, but Matt and I are obviously big board game nerds. We very recently engaged in a epic all-day Twilight Imperium session where Matt embarrassed himself and I covered myself in glory. So I
Not what happened.
When you said Twilight, I thought you were going to say you played an all-day session of Twilight, the board game.
Oh, not this time, but I gotta get my hands on that. But I'm very curious to see what this looks like. I love the idea, and it sounds like there's going to be some perhaps mechanical relationship between the campaign setting and this battle game, some way of like resolving events in the campaign, which is certainly not the first time anyone has tried this, but I'm very interested to see what this looks like when all the stuff is released and we can see sort of like what the intent is.
Well, it's not entirely clear how that the two are going to sort of synergize with one another, because we know for sure that there's not going to be, strictly speaking, a Dragonlance campaign setting that's being released. It's essentially a Dragonlance adventure that's being released. That's
important
called,
distinction. You're right. Thank you.
I believe it's called Shadow of the Dark Queen. I think that they're going to have to do some world building in it, but I think that's not going to be their focus. Their sort of focus is going to be on this. You're a soldier, or you're somebody who's involved in this war, the War of the Lance, and that's your story. I'm imagining It's going to be similar although you're not playing as the heroes of the Lance. I imagine it's going to be a similar structure where the backdrop is this War of the Lance, and you are a group of adventurers trying to sort of navigate your way through this world in chaos. The board game, as I understand it, is going to be how you play out these battles that are going on in the meantime. So the Knights of Solamnia have reinforced the High Clerist's Tower to protect the city of Palanthas. The Blue Dragon army under Kitiara comes in and attacks the High Clerist's Tower. And how do you play that out? You do this board game. The way they describe it is that the two are not necessarily going to depend on each other. In theory, you could play the board game without the adventure, and you could do the adventure without the board game. But I think the idea is that in order to get the maximum experience, you do both together. And Dragonlance has a history of this as well. Even in first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, one of the modules that was released as part of that 16-module series is a board game. They had a board game included in the Tales of the Lance box set. So it's not the first time that they've done this. And the game is designed by somebody who designed one of the games I've heard you talk about. I've never played it. I think it was BattleTech or Battle Mechs or Beetleborgs.
Matt, you got it right. They've got some real, to the extent that there are big names in the
BattleTech world,
board game miniature, world. They have some really experienced designers. So I'm cautiously optimistic to see what this looks like. Obviously, I think it's annoying and goofy if it were required. I don't, people should not have to buy extra stuff to play their to run their game. But as an optional, I mean, again, owning up to my own extreme, I love little miniatures and battle mats nerddom. It's interesting to me. So as long as it's optional and if it's well designed and it works well, I think it could be really, really cool. But I'm curious to see what it actually looks like at the end of things.
I'm curious to see whether it's going to support online play, because I play almost exclusively online.
Well, and that's this is also something that I'm wondering. Wizards has been making some big moves in the online world and have been snapping up more, digital and online assets. And it would be very interesting if there were an online component to this that didn't suck. That would be that would be new for Wizards. But maybe this is the time. Maybe this is when they'll finally get it right.
Do you ever play that game called Battle Chess for Nintendo?
Yes, I did. I did play Battle Chess.
I
didn't think anybody
That's
remembered
how I'm
that.
imagining. That's how I'm imagining the digital version of this is going to be. Like, you get your little 8-bit dragon and your little 8-bit knight, and then you come in and fight each other.
Oh man!
And the rook could turn into a golem-like monster and eat people.
Castle
I love
it turns
that.
into a rock man and smashes it.
I not only did I not think
love
anybody
Battle
else
Chess.
remembered that, I had memory hold that game until just this moment. Battle Chess, wow, that takes
you're
me back.
welcome.
Well, hopefully,
Yeah.
I mean that was great, but hopefully it's better than that. So
It's Stephen Baker who designed Battle Masters, not
Battle Masters. Oh, I'm sorry.
not BattleTech. But yeah, there's the old fantasy kind of war game stuff. But yeah, I'm excited, and yeah, I would also have to say kind of a little skeptical to see hey, can this actually work together? I have a feeling if I played a board game that determined the fate of something in my RPG, I would be very invested in said board game.
Well,
but
Matt,
maybe
you have
too
tried
invested and frustrated.
you
if
have
things
literally
didn't go my way.
tried
I
to do
did
this
try
in our
this.
games,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to mix. Sorry, this is not your fault.
Mixed results.
Mixed results. I loved it as an idea. It was a little hard to execute, which is again why I'm skeptical about this, because it sounds like such a cool idea. You're like, great, your players have set up there's now a big pitched battle. Instead of doing a bunch of annoying mass combat rolls, let's go over to the BattleTech map and resolve it. Again, it sounds fun and if executed well, it's super rad. In practice, it's just kind of wonky sometimes. So I'm excited to see if they take this seriously, or if it's just like an add-on. But
it's going to be interesting.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, I'm just saying all we have right now is just these few rumors, so we're all just speculating.
It's going to be interesting to see exactly how they integrate them together, because if you're doing the adventure, let's say you're doing the adventure and you don't have the board game, how is the result of that battle going to be determined without the board game? Do you flip a coin? Is it just like, is it within the story? Like, because within the story, the good guys win the battle at the High Clerist's Tower. So do you just move on after that point in your adventure? What if you're playing the board game and the bad guys win the battle of the High Clerist's Tower? Do you then have to just completely revise this world to have the bad guys win everything? I think that's going to be interesting to see if they can make the board game not only integrate but really matter.
Yeah.
Like, is it going to just be, well, okay, the bad guys won, well, oh well, the story needs the good guys to win, so.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I think this kind of gets at one of the things Dragonlance is really known for, which is what today we would call, I guess, pejoratively, like railroady type stories, right? Here's a big epic story. You're going to follow this and do these things. Mm-hmm. Obviously, it's one of the most popular set of novels. So, like, if you were trying to pick a Dragonlance plot, let's say you got Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything, and you're like, yeah, let's play a 5th edition Dragonlance game. But if you want to try and choose a story or a time period or a setting or a hook to run a Dragonlance plot, I feel like it would be kind of hard to run the War of the Lance with your own characters, just because so many people have read those stories already. Do you have any suggestions for what you would set a Dragonlance plot? Would you just say, okay, wait for the module to come out? Or do you have any like cool ideas or hooks that would be like really good for a big epic campaign like Dragonlance promises?
Well, I think there's a number of ways that you can do it. You can try to do the original sort of War of the Lance story with your own original characters, so you don't have to play necessarily as the heroes of the Lance, this group of people that meet up together at the end of the last home and go on this adventure. You could start your own campaign, or start the campaign sort of with the same premise with your own players, but you have to be willing to commit to the idea that your players might go off the rails.
Oh yeah.
I think that the idea of railroading, as we think about it now, didn't quite exist at the time that, I mean, it existed in practice, but it wasn't sort of defined then as it is now. When the War of the Lance modules were released, the idea of narrative and game sort of merged together had never been done before. So if it feels railroady, it's because it was the first time that it had ever been done, and nobody knew exactly where to strike that balance yet, which is something that we now have an extra, 40 years of practice on, blending sort of railroading with linear storytelling with open world setting. So I would say just start there. Start at the inn of the last home and that night, and let your players go where they may. If they don't want to pursue the Blue Crystal Staff, they don't have to pursue the Blue Crystal Staff. Let them go in a different direction. It's a big world. It's been very, very well mapped. They can really go anywhere that they want to go. If you want to do this kind of war setting, but you want to completely avoid the structure of the War of the Lance, I would say to set it during what's called the Chaos War, which happens about 30 years after the War of the Lance. And this is what I was describing earlier as like the Ragnarok of Dragonlance. This primordial deity called Chaos appears, and he's got fire dragons and demon warriors, and he's trying to extinguish all life on Earth. And the forces of good and the forces of evil have to align to defeat him. So you can have good characters working together. You can have bad characters working together. You can have people who are just in it for themselves. And the third option that I would suggest that people try is to set their game, if they really want to challenge, set their game post-Cataclysm, when there's no gods and everything is in complete disarray. Because then you can do like almost a post-apocalyptic fantasy game. There's no civilization anymore. There's no law and order anymore. It's just famine and disease and war. And if you want to do something like really dark, like a dark fantasy, dark ages kind of thing, I think that allows for it too. But you got to figure out you got to figure out how you're going to do your healing. But I think that would be another interesting way to try it.
Those are 3 really rad suggestions. It sounds like, okay, do War of the Lance if no one has read those books at your table.
Yeah.
Do the Chaos one if you've got the standard, I've read the War of the Lance, but nothing else. Or go full Mad Max mode.
And you can also do the interwar years is also that's sort of when society is rebuilding, post-war Europe rebuilding after World War II. And that's kind of that 25-year period is kind of where you can do, because there's not the main core stories jump over that 25-year period. So you're not really going to interfere too much with the grand story if you set it during that time period.
In listening to you talk about this and thinking about my players, I also think that if they're the types to chafe at railroading and also not respect the boundaries or potentially not follow sort of the direction you set out for them, it could be very interesting to really lean into the war story aspect of this and have them be a platoon or a squad of mercenaries or something in the war and just either trying to survive or just dealing with it, like Platoon or Full Metal Jacket or something like that. Like really just set them in the middle of a gigantic war and they're just trying to, small stories, survive, stay alive, not frag their superior officer, that kind of thing. And if they're the kind of people who are not going to take well to, you gotta find this X item, or you gotta follow the sort of like rough outlines of the story, that might give them a little bit of room to flex within a very interesting time period and setting, I think.
And you could be kind of like a strike force, maybe you're not part of the actual organized army, but the knights need people with a very specific set of skills to infiltrate the enemy lines and take out the captain or to rescue the prisoner. Or you could also be, sort of war profiteers, like people who are in it, they see the chaos going on all around them and they say, hey, this is a great opportunity to make money or to settle old scores or to go treasure hunting now that nobody's guarding the temple or...
Right. Yeah, right. Now that all the troops are on the front line, there's opportunities. Actually, I really like that. That would be a great neutral, morally gray, evil campaign to run because I do think that even if you're not following the structure of the chronicles, the core books, the core story, it is an interesting moment in time in Krynn, and there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of stories to be told there, even if they're not part of the main one.
And I think that's kind of, again, like we've said 100 times, speculating, but I think that's what the new adventure is going to kind of go towards. You're going to be, because there's like, they show if you've seen the trailer where they've got like the knight of and she looks like a knight of Solamnia with a red robe wizard and a kender, and they're having their little adventure. I imagine that's kind of what this story is. It's called Shadow of the Dark Queen. So it's like, this is happening under the shadow of evil, but we'll have to wait and see, but that's kind of what I think they're going to go for.
Seems likely. But before we go any further with this, you two, we have to talk about maybe some of the more problematic elements of Dragonlance. So we've got, kleptomaniac halflings, the Kinder. We've got gully dwarfs. We've got blonde-haired, blue-eyed people who look like stereotypical Plains Indians. How would you address some of either problematic at the table or just problematic in general things from Dragonlance?
Yes. Number one, don't refer to the Plains people as barbarians. I think that's probably the first thing. In modern games, I usually just call them Plains people or Plains folk. There's also sort of an Inuit proxy of people in Dragonlance who live far to the south who are, they look and act like Inuit people. But there's I don't know if there's a good way to do it. I played Gold Moon in my own campaign, and Gold Moon is one of these plains people. In the books, she has blonde hair and blue eyes. I portrayed her as having sort of like bronze skin, brown eyes, brown hair, much more like Riverwind, who's the other plains person character in the Chronicles trilogy, who is a bit more, at least what you think of, you imagine sort of stereotypical Native American looking person. If there's a good way to do this without culturally appropriating or going into stereotypes, I don't know what it is. I find it's probably best so what I did was for my version of Gold Moon, I had her in appearance look more traditionally Native American, or like plains Native American, but she just acted like fantasy person. I didn't have her like doing any of these stereotypical things that Native Americans do in movies, in old-timey Western movies. She was just fantasy person. I don't think there's a way that you can really reconcile that. Maybe a Native American player who wanted to do something like that could, but I can't speak to that. And I don't want to speak for another culture.
Well, and I think that's a perfectly good approach. And I tend to just would approach when running these problems is just leave them out unless people really want to. There's also Dragonlance, and then this is not actually necessarily a criticism, but was like, well, why are there just half elves? They're gotta be half dwarves and half gnomes and half everything, right? It doesn't make sense. This is always something that didn't make sense to me, so I get it. But also, then you start to get into weird like blood quantum stuff, and I'm like, maybe no half anythings. But let's talk about. Sorry, we're going on long, and I could talk about this forever. But I know there's one thing that we must talk about that Matt touched on, which is Kender. So, Meaghan, can you tell us about Kender, and then we could talk about like what's maybe difficult about them, and then what maybe they might look like in 5th edition.
So Kender is a race that everybody loves and nobody has any problems with, and they're not at all problematic. No, so Kender are the halflings of Dragonlance. There are no traditional Hobbit-type halflings in Dragonlance. There's just the Kender. They kind of look like small elves, like halfling-sized elves. And the idea behind them was to create a character who had rogue-like skills, but wasn't a criminal. Like, they didn't have malice aforethought when they were committing their robberies. So the idea that they came up with, which has lingered with Dragonlance for the past 40 years, was to have this idea of these halflings that are so insatiably curious that anything they see that's interesting or shiny or fun, they pick it up. And they're just so scatterbrained and absent-minded that they forget to put it back. They put it in their pocket. The problem with this, as we know now, is that you don't want to have a race of people that are all inherently criminals. That is very problematic. If you extrapolate that into real world issues, that's not cool. The other problem with Kender is the PvP aspect of it, where players are disrupting the game by stealing their party members' stuff and saying, well, he's a Kender. It's what my character would do.
Giving someone who is maybe not the most considerate person at your table permission to do something that is maybe a little too disruptive.
Right.
And I have had a Kender player like that, so I know the pain of it. But they are trying to revise Kender for 5th edition to kind of remove this kleptomania aspect to their character. In the first Unearthed Arcana for Dragonlance, there was this idea that Kender were magical in nature and that they could like magically produce things out of their pockets. The revised Unearthed Arcana, they got rid of that entirely, and there doesn't seem to be any rules for Kender stealing. I think they're just trying to eliminate that from the rule book so that people getting into Dragonlance in 2022 won't even have this sort of inherited cultural memory of Kender as thieves and can just play Kender however they want to play them. Just this race of people that's very childlike and lighthearted and fun-loving and adventurous. And and sort of the good things about Kender. You know, the Kender are brave and loyal and fun, and you can do all kinds of comic shenanigans with them without this baggage.
Yeah, I think that's the best approach. One of the main problems, I think, is if you look down on your character sheet and you have a special ability for picking someone's pocket, you're going to use that more often than you normally would in a game. If you see that every time you look down your character sheet, and once you get rid of that, then maybe that temptation to be disruptive for the sake of being disruptive is gone.
I think they're just going to phase that out. And I've got there's somebody from at the Dragonlance Nexus who plays a Kender right now who doesn't have that kind of personality. He's like trying to retrieve things that other Kenders have stolen. That's like his whole character arc. And then I have a character in my campaign who's a Kender who's just, I never told her that Kender are supposed to steal, so her Kender doesn't steal. Mm-hmm. And she doesn't know the difference, and it makes the game better for it. So, or just if you want to have a Kender who's sort of that more traditionally classic Kender, just don't have them steal from their party mates. You know, have them steal from NPCs or steal from enemies, or pick up little knickknacks around the dungeon when they're exploring.
Well, and that, again, that makes sense. And my reading of Kender is, they're like, you could play them like, they're like magpies. Like, they pick up shiny things and they like, interesting, neat stuff. But they're not like breaking into people's homes to find shiny things, or like, reaching into your pockets. But they'll grab things of various interest or value and have a small collection. And that's interesting and that's neat. And that, again, that works well with an adventurer. You do not necessarily have to have them completely ignore and disrespect property rights and personal space to have them be kind of that quirky, childlike, interesting, curious, halfling race, which I do see. Again, the Kender annoyed me even when I was a teenager. I understand what the sort of like intent was. I understand like why that would be interesting as a member of an adventuring party. In practice, obviously, it turned out to be kind of an annoyance. But I do think there is room to develop this into a more interesting fantasy species.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that's what they'll do with 5th edition. And I think it's just it comes down ultimately to having to sort of keep players in check. If they're going to run their Kender and they end up doing it this way and falling into those old traps, you got to say, it's not cool to keep doing this. It doesn't matter that the rules said this in 1984. It's 2022.
Right.
You can't be stealing from your players because you're ruining everybody's fun.
Right.
Final question from me. Should I go watch the Dragonlance animated movie?
Oh, I didn't know there was...
It might be the best movie of all time. I think it's actually, despite the fact that it came out in like 2008, I think it's actually going to be up for an Academy Award again this year because it's that good. No, don't watch it ever for any reason.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Ooh, it looks bad. How did I miss this when it came out?
Don't watch it.
Kiefer Sutherland, Lucy Lawless.
Kiefer Sutherland, Lucy Lawless, Michael Rosenbaum. It's got a good cast. It just...
It has a very high voice acting budget and a very low animation
budget. Yeah, I'm looking at some pictures budget. And they're pretty bad.
It's worse than you can imagine.
It's almost like Homestar Runner levels of like flash animation in like ostensibly like a feature film.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as diehard a Dragonlance fan as there is, and I won't watch it.
That seems like a wise choice. I don't have any other questions. Obviously, we could talk about Dragonlance forever, but we've gone deep into speculation. Any like final thoughts or comments for us, Meaghan, before you let you go?
I just wanted to say, in answer to another question that Matt had asked, was about the Gully Dwarves. They're sort of another problematic race in the sense that they're all just stupid.
Oh yeah,
like super stupid. Just leave them out or just have them act like normal dwarves. Your campaign is not going to suffer because your Gully Dwarves are not portrayed as they were in the original edition. Just a thing to hand wave away. Sometimes, you can't correct all the mistakes of the past. Sometimes you just got to there's no way to fix this. Just get rid of it.
I think that's very good advice. Some things are some things just don't work, don't hold up. So leave them out.
Very Dragonlance advice too. Sometimes you've
just
got
reboot
to swing that, reboot
right.
it, swing that balance between good and evil back.
Swing that continuity bat and just get rid of them. Yeah.
Just if you don't like something in Dragonlance, just travel back in time to 1984. Tell Tracy Hickman, don't include Gully Dwarves, and everything's fine. And then that'll screw something else up, and then you're gonna have to go back in time and do it again.
Keep doing it, yeah. That's great advice.
Well, so I mean, I guess we're gonna close out by all singing together Gold Moon song. I've been practicing. It's on the karaoke machine. It's ready to go. First module with a song included. So I mean, we're obviously got to sing that. But final, Meaghan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.
Final Dragonlance thoughts for all of our listeners.
Final Dragonlance thought: listen to the Dragonlance Canticle podcast. Go to DragonlanceNexus.com. Check out Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything.
Links in the show notes below.
And we check out our original 5th edition adventure that's called The Mystery of the Lost Patrol. But I would just say, despite what you may have heard about Dragonlance and all the weird problems that Dragonlance has accumulated over the years, when the new one comes out, just give it a fair chance. If you don't like the new one, then that's fine. But I hope that people who don't know Dragonlance won't be discouraged from playing because of things that they've heard about Dragonlance in the past. And I hope that current Dragonlance fans will give it a fair shake as well and not just say, well, this isn't what it's always been, so I don't like it. I think everybody should give it a chance. If it sucks, it sucks. But if it's worth playing, everyone should play it.
I think that's great advice. Yeah. Well, Meaghan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and knowledge of Dragonlance with us. We will be watching and waiting to see what the final products look like. Everybody do check out Tasselhoff's Pouches of Everything and Dragonlance Nexus. It's a really great resource. Thanks for listening, everybody. You're all beautiful, lovely people. Stay healthy, stay safe, and keep rolling them dice.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
The grasslands are endless and summer sings on, and Gold Moon the princess loves a poor man's son. Her father the chieftain makes long roads between them. Grasslands are endless and summer sings on. The grasslands are waving, the sky's rim is gray. The chieftain sends river when he stand away to search for strong magic and